right? By the same token, longer-term sources of funding allow you to support different types of strategies and activities, so things like direct services in ways that other sources of funding don't. So making sure that as you develop your strategic financing plan, you're always thinking about how your funding sources are aligned with what you're trying to do to make sure that your initiative is sustainable over time. The second thing that strategic financing means is to plan over the long term. And I'm sure that everybody's budget will include the standard 3 years of activities, but I think it's especially important to account for the changing financial needs of your program. So obviously, you're going to need different amounts of money in year 1, year 2, year 3. So when you're developing your strategic financing plan, making sure you've gotten as concrete as possible in figuring out of your initiatives that are going to change over the life cycle of your work. The third principle of strategic financing is to make sure that you have diverse sources of funding. So again, like your personal portfolios, the way your initiative should think about funding sources is to identify as many different types of supports as possible. So that's more than just thinking about funding sources in terms of federal, state, and local, or public and private. It means thinking about different coalitions that you can engage with, issues that are related to children exposed to violence, that you can form alliances with other stakeholders that are working on those issues, and making sure that you have a broad range of sources available to support your initiatives. Right? And the fourth principle of taking a strategic approach to financing is making sure that you're looking at the results of your investment, so the outcomes that you're producing, and knowing how much you're spending to produce what type of results and what you get from those results. So are they saving you money? Are they improving outcomes? And how would you actually know? So again, connecting your thinking about financing your initiatives, again, with your evaluation, data gathering, and outcomes based approach to managing your initiatives. All right, so with that said, there are 5 big picture financing strategies for supporting your initiatives. And the first one is improving the use of existing resources. And these are listed roughly in order of difficulty. So the easiest thing to do is figure out how to use what you already have more efficiently. A couple of examples of how to operate more efficiently would be things like co-locating services, so locating clinicians in police stations, working with school health clinics to provide services, so finding ways to save resources by co-locating and improving coordination in that way. Another example would be coordinating resources, things like trainings, so making sure that you're looking for ways to bring different, reduce any kind of overlap or redundancies. Other communities have done things like negotiate with schools or the public sector to provide rent-free space for things like after-school programs. So looking for unused resources or resources that you can get more out of that are already out there. A third example is achieving economies of scale. And this is everything from the actual services you're providing to things like purchasing and ordering. So a number of communities around the country are experimenting with shared services, for example. A big problem with smaller service providers is that they often don't have the capacity to do the kind of back office activities that an organization needs, and it increases their overall costs. So there are a variety of different approaches that are being developed to share services and drive down costs and therefore free up resources. Another example of increasing efficiency would be improving administrative procedures, so streamlining Medicaid billing, common online forms that can be used across agencies and service providers. So ways to reduce the cost of doing business by operating more efficiently. Another resource that I think people don't always think of is volunteers. So tapping into AmeriCorps and similar networks or other volunteer organizations. And again, I think there's a tendency to sort of think past volunteers because they're often not technically educated in providing the particular services. But volunteers can be used to do things like provide administrative support, provide support, technical support that your initiative might not have access to. So, for example, working with a local Chamber of Commerce on a marketing plan because they might be able to identify some volunteers who would be able to help you develop that. A third way that you can improve the use of existing resources is, again, tracking outcomes to support results-based budgeting, to make sure that the resources you're using are actually achieving the kind of outcomes that justify their use. So, again, that's why it's so important to make sure that your budgeting and financial planning is tightly connected to your overall data gathering and evaluation system. So any questions about improving existing resources? And again, in the resources that I'll make sure get sent along and are available to you are a number of different case studies of how other programs that work with children exposed to violence and child traumatic stress have used some of these strategies. So any questions on resources? All right, so the second strategy is maximizing public revenue. So public revenue is obviously things like entitlement programs, which include Medicaid, foster care, so Title 4E, block grants like community mental health services, discretionary grants, things like obviously Safe Start, and direct payments, things like crime victim compensation. And I have a number of publications that address each of these types of funding sources in much greater detail. So there's a comprehensive list of federal sources of funding and also examples of different state sources of funding, but obviously there's more variability there. But a couple of concrete suggestions about how you would go about maximizing public revenue. The first thing is think about creating a fiscal map. And I think most of you have probably heard of children's budgets, so tracking overall spending on kids and families programs or or programs that serve children exposed to violence. But the idea of a fiscal map is to literally map out all the different public sources of funding, so federal, state, and local, in addition to foundation funding and private sources of support. So you create that big picture for yourself of all the different places that you might go to access different sources of funding. And so, again, this has been partially done for you in some of the documents that I'll send that list all the federal programs. And I think it is important to say that this can be a fairly arduous and time-consuming process because it's a fair number of programs that you would have to collect the data on. But in brief, a fiscal map, aside from listing all those sources of revenue, would look at questions like who administers the program. How is the decision-making process over where that money goes set up? What are the categorical requirements that might affect your ability to use that revenue in different ways? And what is the overall stability of the funding source? So over what time? Is it something that might be cut? And again, creating a fiscal map allows you to put together that big picture so you can more strategically see if you're tapping all the available resources that are out there.